Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk a little more about Jonathan Edwards and his contemporaries. However, we're going to be focusing a little more on George Whitefield, Samuel Morse, and Samuel Belcher. So, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, although both were very well respected in their community and both very important in regards to the Great Awakening, just how do the two contrast? In a faithful narrative, Jonathan Edwards actually addresses the instances that explains his doctrines of grace and redemption, and yet with research from other areas, such as a paper written in classic text in the history of Christianity, we see that George Whitefield actually held much of the same beliefs. George Whitefield spurred much of the movement in terms of the spiritual revival of the 1730s and 40s. His sermons regarding spiritual rebirth and the necessity for salvation were the spark for people like Jonathan Edwards, Samuel Morse, and Samuel Belcher. Much like the Pauline spread of the gospel in the New Testament, the spark that ignited by George Whitefield to these three in particular named men were what ultimately led to the spread of the gospel and the revival during this time. Newspapers actually called George Whitefield the marvel of the age. And George Whitefield was a preacher that was capable of commanding thousands, in particular on two continents, through the sheer power of his oratory skills. In his lifetime, he preached to some 10 million hearers and over 18,000 times. The amazing part to me was the fact that George Whitefield was so influential, yet he was so controversial. Whitefield himself had no church of his own, and he traveled to, different countries, preaching in homes and pastures or wherever he could, some 4 or 5 times a day, and often began before dawn. Much of the preachers that were traveling there this time actually were kind of in the same boat. They were not always treated as welcome visitors by the established clergy, with whom serious conflict sometimes even arose. If we were to look at another aspect of Whitefield, we see that through his inspiration of Samuel Morse, the impact swept into an area that had no real interpretation of the New Light movement. Sometime before 1740, a small group of families, apparently led by Samuel Morse, heard reports of religious revivals and began to explore the idea of personal salvation. No Anglican preacher in their area spoke of this new light, so Morse and others read whatever books they could to obtain knowledge on the addressed subject. And the one that was intriguing to me the most, though, was the final person that we'll address, and that's Samuel Belcher. Here we are able to identify one of the thousands of souls that was harvested during Whitefield's first tour of the colonies. The very fact that George Whitefield directly influenced, but not only that, he directly led Samuel Belcher to Christ, and Belcher went on to become a preacher himself, was really amazing to me. This is just the type of thing that shows the gravity of preachers preaching the unadulterated Word of God.